Hey there, you're listening to Risk Required, the series and book all about the inside track to finance, the tips and tricks that could allow you to find financial freedom and retire from the 9 to 5, just like Ed Pitford did, aged just 32. I'm Gareth Barnett, and joining me is Ed, the man with the financial Midas touch, an investor, entrepreneur, and now author. The information and opinions in this podcast are provided for informational and educational purposes only and do not constitute financial advice. The presenter, production and publisher are not responsible or liable for any analysis made by the audience based on the information in this recording. No parties warrant or guarantee the accuracy or completeness of any information. Audiences should always do their own research or consult an independent financial advisor who will advise based on the individual's specific circumstances. Ed Pitford. We've learned about you, we've heard about you, your upbringing, who you are as an individual, your time at school, at boarding school, being gay, your father passing away, the impact that had on you, your views on finance. We've talked about time at Octopus, at Tesco, about working in Bangalore, working by the side of the road in Italy, about big figures as well. You know, your personal wealth, which you've alluded to, the money that's been pumped into some of your businesses by you and also by some of the funding of finance that's being found as well to support things like truck labs at 100,000 euros, for example. And we've also talked about the risk required. And risk comes in two forms, I guess, it's certainly in the way we're looking at it throughout the course of this podcast. We're going to look at the risk and investing in due course. But we're also going to talk about debt and how debt has allowed you to make money, ultimately. And debt doesn't always do that for some people. Some people, it ruins them financially and sometimes has disastrous consequences. But for you, it's been an empowering tool, a financially successful tool. When it comes to debt, I think first and foremost, we need to tackle the word. We could go and look in the dictionary and say what it means, but I'm interested to know what it means for you. How do you view debt?
You know, I'm still trying to undo a whole however many years of upbringing on debt. You'll find that your parents teach you it's bad, you shouldn't get into debt, credit card debt, bad, pay it off as soon as you can. So debt still comes with a whole load of negative connotations. I still get nervous when I take on more debt. You know, even though I can afford to pay it off, I still get nervous. But it's the only tool effectively available to you, unless you're born very wealthy, to get wealthy. So yes, there is a lot of negative stuff around debt, and the expensive debt is something to really try and avoid, and we can go into that some more. But also, debt is the tool that's going to help you get out of the situation you're in and become more financially free.
I'm going to kind of push on this debt word because not everyone has done an MBA, not everyone understands finance. You know, we're taught at school about simultaneous equations, about algebra, about maths. We're not talking about finance. So again, this definition of debt, what is it?
So debt is just borrowing money. So it's money, it's someone else's money that you're using at that point in time. That's probably the simplest way to look at it, which in itself isn't a bad thing. It's like they've lent you some money, and that can be for good reasons and bad reasons. And then, you know, in the investing side, we'll get onto equity, which is, you know, shares of a business. But debt is literally borrowing money, probably at a fixed interest rate that you'll then have to pay back the money you borrowed and some extra. But it can be at a 0% interest rate with no fees, even available to person on the street from a high street bank. So it doesn't always come with interest to be paid.
You allude to there the fact that debt has numerous forms, and people listening to this, I guess, will be most used to credit cards, mortgages, loans for a car, Klarna even, to go, you know, buy now, pay later. It is pervasive in every part of our lives.
It's everywhere, and it's getting pushed onto you, and you see it more so in America, where it's everywhere. You know, debt. They're trying to get you into debt because that's kind of a big way that banks make money, and the fees and charges around that, they make a lot of money off that. So they're going to push it onto you, just as the retail side of things, they're going to push you to buy stuff. And so there's billions being pumped into making you buy, and there's billions being pumped into making you borrow, and there's very, very little being pumped into making you invest, unless you're a high net worth individual, and then people are spending some money to try and take your money off you. So yeah, there's a lot of debt out there, and there's kind of student debt and car loans and so on, and they're all quite complicated. So I do a lot of investing. I've got an MBA, I work in finance, did a physics degree, so numbers I get. But it's really difficult stuff, which the banks are kind of telling you it's simple, and it's not. But I don't want people to think, oh no, I can't do it. It is not beyond your abilities. And I will go through in the book more step by step what you should be doing in Excel, what you're looking for, how to compare different rates you're being offered. And some of that might sound really boring, but the financial reward can be huge. So, picking a different mortgage can be thousands of pounds difference between the two. And the bank's just presenting them to you and not really always telling you the full story. They might tell you what's a safer choice. But as we keep saying, sometimes you've got to take a little risk, and it can pay dividends.
It feels as though the societal approach to debt is that always the person effectively, if it's being lent money, that person is always on the make, and that as the person in debt, you are always in a negative position. But your perspective is that you can leverage debt to put yourself in a positive position, maybe not immediately, but going forwards.
Yeah, and so that's probably a good point to bring in, like the first little trick that I did. Again, I'm not claiming I came up with all this stuff. It was someone at work who told me about this, and I was like, that is brilliant. So you can borrow money on a credit card and then invest that, and then get the gain off the investment, and then pay the money back, and you're effectively making money out of nothing. So if we take an example now, so you can do what's called a money transfer on a credit card, which means that you're transferring money from that credit card to your bank account. So you're borrowing money, effectively. That's all that money transfer means, is they're going to transfer you some money. And there's credit cards out there that will do this with 0% fees, 0% interest for 20 months. So if you're going to do this for the right reasons, that is an amazing offer. If you're going to do this for the wrong reasons and go and buy a holiday and then owe that money at the end of 20 months but not be able to pay it back, that's a problem. But if you're going to take that money and invest it, and when it's at 0%, you don't have to invest that somewhere risky. You can put that in a savings account and get 4%, and you're still making a profit. So borrow £3,000 on that, invest it at 4%, and then at the end of the 20 months, it's only in a savings account, you pull it straight out. There's no risk to not be able to get that money and pay it off, and you've just magicked yourself some money for what's arguably a couple of hours of work. And I can guarantee you that will be a better rate than you're getting paid by your employer.
I'm just putting my bank hat on for a second, though. And I'm sure it doesn't say when you apply for a credit card, are you going to use this for investment?
Yeah. So, and they will probably tell you that using it for investment is too risky, which is absolutely crazy, when using it for a holiday is not deemed too risky, when actually there you're definitely going to spend the money, and here you're quite likely to still have the money left at the end of the 20 months. When I've done this trip before, I haven't said I want it for investing. I've said I want it for a holiday or whatever, and then decided not to go on that holiday. Sometimes, I'm not going to say you should break the law or break the rules, but I don't think the rules are always there in your favor. They are there to stop you borrowing that and gambling it and getting yourself into a scary position. But if you're borrowing it to invest in, a savings account, there can't be anything wrong with that, because you're definitely not losing that money, assuming that you've got less than 75,000 in that bank and the bank doesn't go bust.
And we said it at the beginning of this podcast, but this is very much in that kind of disclaimer, that kind of the legalese. This is very much referenced in the book, and also now your experience. And people at the end of the day should ultimately do what is right for them. And if they're not entirely sure, then speak to someone who can look at their exact specifics and go, this is or isn't right for you.
Yeah. But also, when you're having those conversations, remember that the person advising you is there to stop you taking on what they deem as unnecessary risk. And it's only you that can decide how much risk you want to take. They'll be there advising you not to take risk, to play the safe route. Because if you lose money, that's their problem, because they've advised you. So at some point, you've got to take ownership of this and work out how much risk you actually want to take, and push yourself out there a little bit. And one thing I think is always useful to remember when making investments is normally there's no limit to how much you can make, but there's a limit to how much you can lose. You can lose what you put in. So you can lose 100%, but you can make 1,000% or 10,000%. Like the upside is not capped generally. So keep that in mind when someone's warning against risk.
Someone might be listening and going, you can lose what you put in. And some people are like, I can't really afford to lose anything. And I guess this comes down to then individual perspectives on debt. And you talked about it in the first episode about the fact that you kind of put £3,000 in early investments into truck labs, for example. And whilst that is not an insignificant amount of money in itself, it's not millions, hundreds, tens of millions. And it strikes me that you were able to, and you talk about this in the book, use relatively small amounts to ultimately have big success.
Yeah. I'm not a crazy risk taker. I'm not.
Other people would disagree with that.
True. Yeah, but in my mind, I'm investing what I think I can afford to lose. That if I'd lost that £3,000, I still had a job. I still had kind of money coming in. I could cover my day-to-day expenses. And when I borrow to invest as well, I make sure that there is a way I can pay that back. I'm not going to borrow 10 grand on a credit card and put that into a startup business because with no other backup plan to pay that £10,000 back. So either I know that I've got something else I can sell to pay that £10,000 back, or I put it into something safe like a savings account, and then I'm going to be able to pay that back. It's a calculated risk. But yeah, you're right. Some people would tell me that borrowing to invest at all is just not okay. But I think that's because a lot of the time these high street banks, etc., they have to give advice which is applicable to everybody. And they don't have time or money to look at everyone's individual circumstances. So it's a broad brush approach. And that's where it's down to you to look at your circumstances and see what you're comfortable with taking on debt-wise.
You talk about in the book, and we talked about last time, that perhaps the greatest, I think for most people, the scariest thing that perhaps you've ever done with regards to debt, surely, is remortgaging your house, your flat, to invest into Octopus. What went through your mind? What led you to do that?
Yeah, you're right. No one would ever advise you to do that, and it was a bit of a battle with the bank to persuade them that was okay.
Did you have to tell them that that's what you were intending to do with that cash?
So there's two reasons that they might lend you money. One's to invest in the company you work for. Crazy, because that's like, oh, I'll take on risk to invest in the company that's paying my salary. So you really concentrate on that risk, but that's okay for some reason. And I also found out that you can say you're going to invest in the bank's stocks, and they can't say that's too risky because that would be a really bad signal to the world. So I told them I was going to invest in the company I work for, which was a legitimate reason, and that was okay. Yeah, it was scary. And, I was telling other friends they should do it, and they'd chat to their parents, and it was like, absolutely no way. But looking at kind of why I did it, I could see how Octopus was valued. I worked there, so I could see all their revenue streams and their costs and the growth and work out what I thought was a fair valuation, and they did the same and worked out what they thought was a fair valuation, and my version of the truth was double what they were saying. So I was like, there's loads of kind of potential in here and loads of room for it to go wrong before I would actually start losing money myself. And so I felt really comfortable and confident because I effectively had an inside track. And no, that's not insider trading because they are not listed on a stock market. This is a private company. So I was very much taking my own view on what I thought the value was. And yeah, it paid off dividends. I look back at a text message the other day I sent to a colleague being like, it's probably a good time to remortgage your flat and go all in on this. And they were like, yeah, good idea. And then I messaged them the other day, like, did you do it? And they're like, no, kind of kicking themselves now. But yeah, it is risky, and it could have done a bulb. Bulb's another big fast growing energy company, and that collapsed. So there was an element of risk in there, but there was some calculation around it. And had it all gone wrong, I could sell the property and rent somewhere. Like it's not like I would have gone negative at any point. So it sounds really risky, but there was a cushion there still.
You have purposefully got into debt with regards to the mortgage, for example, to then invest, which the bank said was perfectly allowable. But there are people, often through no fault of their own, through circumstances they don't have control over, whether that's family, work, environment, health, global financial issues, that end up in debt. And sometimes debt that is more than they can manage, more than they can afford on a daily basis. Debt that often has huge personal, financial, mental, physical implications. And you in the book approach that and talk about how you maybe see breaking out of that in ways that enable them to then put that behind them.
Yeah. And I think, because I work in finance and because I'm also been working on this book, I've been, people have been more open with me about their stories, and I've interviewed a few people around their financial position, and sometimes it's really scary. So some might have tens of thousands of credit card debt, a loan from Monzo, borrowed some money off family, and you stack it all up, student loan as well. And it's quite a scary amount. And some of them are kind of doing that for the first time when they're chatting to me. They're kind of putting it all out, and probably the first time they've ever told anybody about it, because it's the kind of thing you keep to yourself. People are scared to talk about it. And I guess one bit of reassurance for people is there's a lot of people in that position. So it's worth talking with people, getting a bit of help. When I'm looking at helping someone who's got themselves into that position, first it's starting with that really high interest credit cards that might be charging you 50% a year, which is kind of crazy money. So for them, doing those, a bit like the money transfer I talked about, but do a balance transfer. So that's borrowing off a credit card to pay that credit card off, but you're borrowing at hopefully 0%, maybe with 5% fee or something, to pay off the 50% a year cost there.
And that's a fairly established method, isn't it?
Yeah. But people are not doing it. They're just paying off the minimum, thinking they're okay and they'll get by, whilst the problem kind of slowly gets worse. And then what's even worse with that is the credit card company will come along and be like, oh, let's increase your credit limit because it looks like you're near the edge, and let them borrow even more and make that problem even worse. And I think they think because the credit card company is doing that it's okay to spend that bit more and so on. So I think for some of these people, part of the thing is taking away that ability to spend, because if it's there, they'll spend it, because there's so much pressure these days, just from Instagram, but also from your friends and so on, to go out and to go out for dinner, buy drinks, all these things, buy presents for people, all this pressure to spend, and it's very hard to say no. So they keep doing this stuff because they feel they ought to, and they feel other people are doing it, and saying no is not really there. So take away the ability to spend, and then that starts to help you to say no and be a bit more regimented. I did have one friend where I put their credit card on a bonfire, and it's not great for the environment, but I just needed to get rid of their ability to spend so that they could start to crawl their way out of that position. Unfortunately, I had a photographic memory, so they've still got it on their phone and they're still paying for things, but it would have slowed the spending a little bit. And a lot of people don't really know how much they spend. They just trying to make the end of the month. But when you actually work out how much they've got, a lot of the time it's kind of £8, £10 a day for their expenses beyond their living and their bills. And that's really hard to live off. And that can be thrown out the window by taking an Uber or having
going for coffee.
One night out. Yeah, exactly. So you've got to be really, really careful. And it's something kind of growing up was kind of naturally given to me. My parents are very careful with money. You wouldn't go out for coffee, or a restaurant was kind of once or twice a year treat. So I'm kind of lucky in that was kind of naturally there. But for a lot of people, that's that kind of strictness hasn't been there in their childhood. And it turns out a lot of this does come from how your parents were with money, how your childhood was, etc. So it's not necessarily your fault that you're where you are, but it is something that you now have control of, and you're the only person who's going to help you. What's going to swing in with this check. And actually talking about that, it brings me on to the lottery, which please stop playing the lottery, because people
you might win big.
You might win big, but the chances are so poor. You're looking at I don't know how many 0.00000%. It's just you're better off putting 10 quid a month into some shares, and your return will be so much better.
I was once told, and I don't know the veracity and quite how accurate these percentages are, but I'm sure it's not too wildly off. If you buy, and this might have changed now, but if you bought a ticket for the lotto, not the Euro Millions, which has even bigger odds, or even worse odds depending on how you want to see it, but if you bought a ticket for the lotto, and the National Lottery draw on a Monday, you're more likely to die than win by the Friday, which is terrifying. Listening to you talk about debt, though, you kind of talk about things that are within people's control. About you don't have to always go for a coffee. You don't always have to go for a prep. You don't always have to spend some of that important £8 or £10 you have that day for things other than living expenses. But not everyone has control over things like interest rates. I think at the moment it's particularly at the forefront of people's minds. And I'm just very aware that someone listening to this, someone reading the book as they leaf through the pages and get through the chapters, you talk about events from 2009 onwards, and some of the environments that you were able to borrow in and trade in and deal in are very different to what they are now.
Yeah, it's really hard. And so following the steps that I've put, it will make your position less bad. I'm not saying it will make it amazing and great. It won't be as easy as I had it. It won't be as easy as your parents had it. But that's also a reason that their advice might not be the best advice anymore, because they were able to buy a house quite easily. And now, even looking back to when I bought a flat kind of 10 to 15 years ago, it's twice as hard now. The prices have gone through the roof, the wages haven't kept up, and then added to that, the interest rates. So it's really, really tough, and there's no getting around that. And that does lead people to give up and to be like, well, screw it, I'll have that Starbucks or whatever. And I know that not buying Starbucks does not buy you a house, but what it does is, you save that £5 a week, and then you put that into investments, and then the investments grow, and then eventually you get to a point where you've got enough to start doing some of the more interesting investments that go up a lot quicker. So it's a long, slow road, and it's longer and slower and more painful than anyone's ever had it. But if you don't start it, you're going to get left behind. You're going to go off that debt cliff and end up with the bailiff's round, or being put into bankruptcy and then not being able to get a loan for anything, and it just gets worse. So however bad it is, you kind of got to stick with it and kind of take control of it, because no one's going to be there for you otherwise.
I'm sure some people listening will assume that, and we touched on the fact that you are a wealthy man, that you surely then have no debt now. Is that the case?
No. So those money transfers and balance transfers I've been talking about, I manage those. So I have £55,000 of credit card debt over, 5 or 6 credit cards, and that moves around. So when one of them kind of comes due, I'll have the money there in case I need to pay it off. But normally I can then put that onto another card and borrow again. And sometimes that comes with a cost. So you might be talking 5% for a year, but I have confidence that in my investments, I'll beat that, and therefore it's worth taking that on, and beat that, not just 6%, but I have to beat that after tax. So, I have to know that I can get 8%, say, to cover the 5% and so on. And then I've got 2 mortgages, because I had the original mortgage when I bought my flat, and then the remortgage when I'm all into Octopus. So yeah, I'm sitting on a reasonable amount of debt, and I wish I could sit on more. I tried to borrow more, but that was after I had stopped working, so I didn't have an income anymore, and therefore people are way more reluctant to lend to you. So even though I could afford to pay it back multiple times, that doesn't count for the banks. They need income and to follow these rules. And that is something, again, I find really frustrating, that I'm not allowed to take on my own risk. I'm told what risk I'm allowed, but that is definitely a first world problem. At some point, I will get into the realms of the private banking world where they're willing to lend to me based on pure assets.
You mentioned the banks, you mentioned mortgages. It strikes me that when you look for debt, when you search for debt, I guess you're also in the position to be able to do so, but you are going down established routes. You're not going to, I assume, friends, family, and there are other people who, have ended up having to go to loan sharks, for example, and pay huge percentages and put themselves in tricky positions. But for you, and I assume you would advocate, always going to regulated, established sources of finance where possible.
Yeah, loan sharks scare me, because you don't know what will happen when you can't, or if you can't afford to pay.
And family, it can get complex and opaque, and not always necessarily have the security or framework or kind of guarantees that it would if it's a bank, for example.
When I have lent to friends, I will put a loan agreement in place.
Contract.
Which I'm used to from work, so I kind of know the kind of things I want to put in there. But that protects them as much as me. It's all written down in paper, it's clear. It avoids those arguments later. Borrowing off friends and family, okay, you probably need to do it these days, to be honest. Borrowing off the banks when it's cheap, it's not... look at... really frustrates me is what they call the arranged overdraft on your current account. And arranged overdraft makes it sound like it's okay, it's fine, but they're then charging you 40%, 50% on lending you 100 quid you were over that month. You're not that risky, and they're charging you as if you're, I don't know, a business about to go under the next week. It's a disgusting cost, when really that should be almost free, because they know your salary is going to come in next month and you're covered, and you're only borrowing 100 quid or something, or 200 quid, and they call it arranged and make it sound like it's fine to go into it, but actually that's really, really expensive debt. So if you're sitting on that and you've got some investments in the kind of FTSE 100, you should be selling them and paying off that 40% debt, because it's very unlikely those investments are going to beat 40% plus tax in a year.
To what degree then do you think there needs to be societal and sectoral, and I mean that from a kind of banking perspective, rethink, reimagination, recalibration, whatever you want to call it, about debt as a concept?
Yeah, a huge one. And we're kind of brought up in a society where we are going to save up, put a deposit down on a house, buy a house, and then slowly pay down that mortgage. And that's kind of what we're expected to do. That's not the most economically sensible thing to do. The most economically sensible thing to do is rent all your life, which sounds strange to people, but it's a hard concept to explain. But if you bought a property to rent out in London, you might expect a kind of 2% yield on that. Okay, let's call it £1 million property. So that might rent out for 20 grand a year, say. But if you invested that £1 million, then you could get 10% on that, so 100 grand, and then rent £1 million house for 20 grand, and you'd have the 80 grand difference. Whereas if you bought it, all your money is tied up in that property, and you've got the maintenance of the property, etc. Yes, you can borrow money to do that because they're happy to lend you money to buy a house, but not to invest in shares. So the maths is a bit more complicated. But from a simple point of view, you're more likely to be better off investing your money in some high yielding businesses than in property. And also, that's far better for the country that you're putting your money into the high growth small businesses that generate jobs than into property, which just makes the housing crisis worse. And especially when it comes to banks lending for people's second and third properties, it kind of really angers me. All they're doing is making the problem worse and stopping people invest in stuff that will create growth for this country and then tax and then afford to the NHS, etc., that we need.
We're going to talk in the next episode about investments, and you've invested in lots of businesses. We talked about the fact you have kind of a bit of a Midas touch of investing in businesses when they're sometimes just an idea, and you've invested in everything from renewable energy to truck aerodynamics to record labels to everything in between as well. When it comes to debt, if you were to look back on the last 10, 15 years, which one has been the best for you personally that has enabled the best investment?
I mean, it's still going to be that remortgage to invest. But that's not the best return I've got. But that was on such a large scale that I didn't need to go up that much for me to make some real considerable money, like making an extra salary within a year just because it was borrowed money. I've been incredibly lucky on that one. That has gone, valuations are somewhere, but 3 to 10 times my money probably on that mortgage money. And I've paid roughly 2% a year on that. So, I've had that mortgage, 6 years now. I'll have paid about 12% on that and made 300 or 400 or 500%. So yeah, it's really, really proved the point that taking on debt is worth doing.
In episode 4, we're going to get onto politics because that is a growing and developing part of your career. We're also, in the next episode, going to talk about investing because that is where, let's be honest, you've made your money, and we've alluded to some of the things you've done. And dear listener, if you've forgotten some events past and want to remind us where it all began, and that all started in the first episode. But in episode 3, it's your views, it's your take, it's your reality of investing.
Thanks for listening to my podcast. For everything the banks don't want you to know, you'll find the details in my book, Risk Required, out soon.